Welcome to Riding Westward. I'm your host, Brent. Have we talked enough about Western environments and public lands over the past 3 years on this podcast? Well, we have talked about them from a variety of angles, but I'm not done yet. With the prevalence of public lands in the West and the simultaneous developments of wildfire seasons lengthening, droughts worsening, ecosystems collapsing or being unbalanced, and demographic pressures mounting across the West, we need to continue writing and thinking about the land and our relationship to it. Today we talk with Professors Erika Wolters and Brent S. Steele, both political scientists and public policy experts at Oregon State University, about their edited collection, The Environmental Politics and Policy of Western Public Lands. Despite my sometimes dour outlook, they and the volume's contributors balance exhibition of real crises with a healthy dose of optimism. Enjoy. For new listeners, let me take a quick moment to explain a bit about the podcast. Each episode features a conversation with authors, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, academics, or others who write about the North American West. Our goal is not only showcase their work, but to spark curiosity among you, the listeners, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who call it home. If a writer intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing the roles of host, producer, sound engineer, and just about everything else, all of which entail tasks for which I have very little training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and all the work is well worth the excuse to read more and to talk to interesting people. At the end of this episode, I will include some more information on me and my scholarship, and on the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. With all this business out of the way, let's move on to today's conversation. First, I'd like to introduce to you who it is we're talking to and why. Erika Wolters is an assistant professor of political science and associate director of the Public Policy undergraduate program in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University. Her research focuses on environmental behavior, adaptation, and policy in response to resource use and conservation in an era of rapid climate change. Brent S. Steele is professor of political science and director of the Public Policy graduate program at Oregon State University, which offers the Master of Public Policy, Executive Master of Public Policy, and the PhD in Public Policy. He teaches courses in science policy, public policy theory, rural policy, climate change politics, and energy policy. Their collection of essays, The Environmental Politics and Policy of Western Public Lands, was published by Oregon State University Press in 2020, but it is also available digitally for free, and it will be, as they update it in the future, via OSU Open Educational Resources. This collection features writers from fields of political science, public policy, environmental science, the law, and others. It's an excellent primer on a variety of intersecting topics about the environment, about policy, about public lands in the West. It is powerful as a collection because together they demonstrate how interconnected our Western environmental problems and solutions are. The individual chapters are also useful as standalone pieces. This collection should be considered by anyone interested in public lands, be it the general public, professors, academics, or students. Professors Erika Wolters and Brent Steele, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You guys are zooming in from Oregon, both of you?
Yes.
And just coming
Yes.
off of some record hot temperatures.
Yes.
It sounds like Erika is out of town. I was chatting with her earlier, but Brent, you were in town for the 110 plus degree heat?
Yes. Yeah. It's very, very hot.
Wow. My parents live up in the Northwest, and they don't have air conditioning, and as many people don't, but you survived one way or the other?
Yes. When we moved here back in the 90s, hardly anyone had air conditioning. And then, over the years, as it's gotten hotter and hotter, people been adding AC to their homes. And so I couldn't imagine the last couple of days without AC with the temperatures here.
Let's get to business. Let's talk about this anthology, which you two edited, The Environmental Politics and Policy of Western Public Lands. I saw the title and immediately thought, I need this book. I've been thinking about these kinds of things a lot. And I was particularly interested because I've approached it mostly through reading from historians, some sociologists, journalists, and others. And the contributors in your book and yourselves are from some different disciplines. So I'm excited to compare kind of differences in approach. Can you tell us about how this collection came to be? What was the impetus?
Sure. Well, in 2001, a colleague of ours, Dr. Charles Davis at Colorado State University, published a book on the environmental politics and policy in the West as well. And we approached Chuck and asked him if he was wanting to do an updated version, because a lot of us in the field use his book in our classes that we teach. And he said, no, but go ahead, kind of gave a blessing to Brent and I to move forward with our idea to then to kind of do an updated version. So Brent and I came up with the idea that it would be great to sort of get some of the leading experts in the field and in different disciplines to come together and put together a really good anthology for our students to be able to use, but that's also readable to people maybe not within the discipline. So it's a very accessible book, and it's one that stands alone chapter by chapter. So you don't have to read it all the way through from the beginning to the end. You can kind of pick and choose if you have chapters you wanted to read. Because mostly we felt that the West had changed significantly, and we wanted to capture that and identify what's going on within the realm of environmental policy in the Western US.
Yeah, and one of the unique features of this book too is that not only is it published by Oregon State University Press, but it's also available open source for people to read and to use in their classes if they'd like.
That's great. I'm actually just now noticing on the back cover, it says co-published with OSU Open Educational Resources. I didn't even realize that before. That's really great. Are there big updates from Chuck's previous book to what you guys are doing now? As we're, a full 20 years into the 21st century, what are some of the big topics that you wished was in that previous volume that you wanted to have updated?
Well, one thing Eric and I did was ask everyone to try to put a climate change perspective on each chapter, which really wasn't in the previous book because that really wasn't much in the public dialogue at the time. And so, given we started out talking about the record heat here in the Pacific Northwest, I mean, it's a very, very important topic. And of course, we had unprecedented wildfire last summer also in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. Which I witnessed yesterday. I did a float trip down the McKenzie River in Oregon, which is a beautiful, pristine river. It's where Eugene, Oregon gets its water supply. And as we went down the river, we went by Blue River, which was a small rural community that no longer exists. And then down to Vida, another small community with about half of Vida was gone. And so you just see these burned out structures. So obviously with increasing drought and climate change, it impacts pretty much every single topic we had in the book.
With that, and I think that we're very cognizant of the fact that the West is changing rapidly, and that there's so much more population growth coming to the region. There's a lot more challenges to public lands. There's challenges to indigenous rights of lands as well. And we wanted to sort of capture that in the context of, as you see, sort of this old West narrative and the new West narrative, and sort of what's going to be happening for the next West. What do we, the grander sort of idea is sort of thinking about what do we want the West to look like in the ideal sense, and then maybe in the reality of what do we think will happen if we sort of continue on this trajectory.
That's great. I'm about to publish an anthology on the 21st century West, thinking about late 20th century Western histories and then kind of pulling them, updating them for the first 20 years of the 21st century. And this was kind of a lot of these bigger ideas that you guys are thinking about were in our minds as well as we workshopped papers, thinking about where's the West been recently, where is it today, and what does that mean for moving forward. As I look through the contributor list, I see political scientists, people involved in public policy. There are scientists, kind of environmental scientists. I think there's a couple lawyers, there's people involved in the law. And as I noted, at least here on the podcast, most of our engagement with public lands has been from more of a historical perspective. And I'm curious about disciplinary approach, and what are questions you think that you and your contributors may have asked differently, or what are different questions that you would have asked as opposed to a historian, say, looking at public lands issues? How do you approach this differently than some of us in the humanities and elsewhere?
Well, it has as a title suggests, a distinct politics orientation, and one of the things, there's always been conflict in the West, political conflict over public lands and lands management and endangered species, forests, water. But one of the things that we focused on here was the different interests that have been involved, that have different perspectives on things, and then a little bit more of and I would argue there's a couple, Mark Brunson, for example, who wrote the piece on rangeland policy, is more of an environmental sociologist in there too. So we tried to look at things kind of and as a historian would do, a broad perspective. But I think the focus here was on conflict and what's going on now and what might happen in the future, as we have, increasing drought, and we have change in urbanization in the West. We have these cities are growing and becoming much different than what they used to be. And for example, Salt Lake has had a major change politically over the last couple decades. Tucson, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and so we have different views on how management of public land should take place, increasing conflict, and then we have the backlash that we talk about too. And one of the things that happened this year is we had two elections where, for example, we had 7 rural counties in Oregon considering joining Idaho instead of staying in Oregon, and as an indication of the conflict. And then we had the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and there's potential conflict coming in again. Well, there is continued conflict in the Klamath River Basin, but it could get very dicey, very polarized, even more so with shutting off of the irrigation water to save fisheries.
Yeah, and the Bundys are back up there organizing in the Klamath Basin, right?
Yeah.
I know that historians, we like to think that our work has relevance to the present, and sometimes we bring our work all the way to the present, but often it's only like in an epilogue or some concluding thoughts. The more presentist we get, the more uncomfortable we often get. And that's one reason I do like playing with some of these other disciplines where you guys are, I mean, the present is, where you live, and you're very comfortable thinking out loud about it and not prognosticating about the future, but looking forward and trying to project where we might be headed or things that we might need to do differently.
And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to go with the open source as well, because we have the ability to change chapters, to update, to do anything like that, every year if we wanted to. And I think Brent and I wanted that flexibility to be able to, because as soon as you write things and as soon as administrations change or something like that, suddenly it's a game changer. And we want to make sure that 5 years down the road, we're going to be able to capture where we are at that time versus where we were when we wrote the book.
That's a great feature then of having this open source. You mentioned that you use this in classes for students, and I'm curious about audience. I know who historians write for, I know who journalists write for, and this is a podcast about people who are writing about the West or writing for the West. So for political scientists, public policy people, outside of this book, and then we'll pivot to the book, like, what are the audiences that your disciplines generally write for?
So this book was more publicly accessible than some of our other work. And so we were gearing it towards kind of junior senior level undergraduates or graduate students and the general public. So we tried to write it, to make it accessible. And, we there are a variety of different disciplines in here that write differently. So we had a little bit of editing to try to make kind of that same level of accessibility. But that's kind of the general orientation, for this particular book. And when Erika was talking too, that we had the open source so we can update it. So just an example of that. A couple of years ago, I was writing an NSF grant to look at mitigation and planning for wildfire in the West, and we actually have the Wasatch Range in our project. We've got a Wenatchee area up in Washington, and we included the southern Willamette Valley. And the first time we submitted our grant, it got rejected by NSF because they said there isn't wildfire in the Willamette Valley because there hadn't been a history of it. And so we finally, we put in a case study of Central Oregon instead around Deschutes from Bend, where Bend is. And so we got the grant, and this is with faculty at University of Oregon and Portland State University. And then last summer happened, and so we wrote back in and said, change of plans here, NSF, we're gonna go back and look at the Willamette Valley because the winds and the drought conditions were unprecedented. And so having the open source with the print version, we can't go back and make revisions to that, but with the open source, we can.
Are you often writing for policymakers? And
I think we hope that it ends up in policymakers' hands, and we certainly put it in that direction so that it's capturing, again, sort of from the different perspectives, what's going on and how we need to start thinking about these issues that we see as intractable, but ways that we can maybe hopefully move forward on addressing some of them, because climate change is not going to improve, but we know, unless there's large scale efforts to do so, but we know that we can start thinking more about water, about fire, about all of these things that are happening in the West, and hopefully start at least mitigating some of the current and impending problems that are arising from those things.
Yeah, so the conclusion of the book is aimed at the public at large, but policymakers, and we talk about lessons learned in the book, but ways to try to overcome some of the polarization and conflict. And so there's a theme, in Oregon's kind of known for its watershed councils and for collaborative governance approaches to natural resource decision making and policy making. So with the pitch there is definitely towards policymakers and the public.
What do you feel like the policymakers or the general public are missing? What is it? Just the background information? Is it that they're missing someone who can translate science and data into something digestible? What's the missing component that makes these problems not just intractable? Because climate change isn't going to go away, but we seem to be having the same fights about public lands that we were having 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago. So what's missing from the dialogue, and how might this book or the other things that you and your contributors are writing contribute to solving that?
Well, I can take a shot at this. So I just did a plenary with a conference, an international conference on. They were focusing on wicked problems, and so that's one of the things that the public lands management in the West is. It's a wicked problem. It cuts across multiple jurisdictions. It has multiple interests involved. And it requires kind of a big picture approach. So one of the approaches we've been using at Oregon State University is what we call KTANs, KTAN, and it's knowledge to action networks. And it's trying to get scientists out of their laboratories and working directly with communities and all the stakeholders in the community on problem solving and getting the communities, the stakeholders involved in the science process, and then having the scientists try to help integrate the science in a fashion that's understandable to the layperson. And even in these teams are interdisciplinary too. So we try to involve social sciences. So we focus on process, not just the science, because there's more than science that's important in these collaborative processes. There's people have understand the history there, what the issue's been like, how the resource has been managed over the past. And so that's kind of one attempt. And that's trying to bring in a big picture kind of perspective at the local level, at a community level or watershed level.
Well, and I think if you look at public surveys in the West, you see high levels of support for conservation of lands, for water protection, for various species protection, and that kind of spans the political spectrum. And so I think really it's hoping that we start moving a narrative forward where we do have some shared values around the West and around public lands and around use and conservation. And I think that that's something that needs to be communicated more clearly, that we do have overlap in sort of how many of us would like to see the West still be, in the sense that we can go out and we go hunting or fishing, or we can go backpacking or whatever those things are, or just knowing that it exists for species protection. I think that those things do transcend a lot of our political differences. And so I think it might be really important that we start constructing a narrative around that, where we do recognize that there are some pretty deep-seated shared values about the West and the Western identity.
That's a powerful statement, that there's more consensus than we perhaps realize, and it's untapped, and it just needs to be given a narrative so that people can see, oh, we're on opposite sides of this political spectrum, and the rhetoric we use to talk about public lands is often so opposed, but when we strip some of that away, there's actually a lot of shared values and things that we're all interested in. We might disagree about how to fix it, but we have some shared concerns. We had a wildfire just in the hills right above my neighborhood it was October or November. It was like 2 or 3 days before the temperatures dropped and it started raining. It was just the worst timing of it, just could have waited. But I was standing with some of my neighbors watching the fire, and these are neighbors that I know I do not see eye to eye with politically. But we were all lamenting the same thing, right? I'm a heavy trail user. I use the trails that were getting burned. They don't, but we both were concerned, about what was going on. So that's a very optimistic, hopeful idea that there's more consensus than we think. As you teach this to students as a unique audience, and maybe specifically for you, Brent, you've been engaged with students for a little bit longer than Erika, I think. Do you see a change in the new generation of how they think about public lands and these things?
Yeah, that's what makes me optimistic. Young people really care about communities. They care about people. They seem to be a lot more open-minded about different issues. They are very much focused and worried about the future and what climate change means for our beautiful public lands and spaces in the West. And so it's been easier to engage them, at least here where I've been at Oregon State University and previously at Washington State University. It's never been easier to engage them and to have, at the one time, great concern about climate change and the things happening in the world right now, but at the same time, the possibilities of coming together and problem solving.
Well, that's hopeful as well. Maybe the kids are all right.
Kids are all right.
I'm constantly impressed with the students I work with here, and I'd say if I was an undergrad today, or even a grad student, I wouldn't have a chance stacked up against some of them. Well, maybe we should turn to the book itself. I know this is a little bit awkward, and it's one of the reasons I haven't featured an anthology before, because it's weird to ask the editors to come on and to talk about the contributors or to put words in their mouths. It puts you in a little bit of a odd situation. So we'll keep this maybe kind of in the most general of terms. But you divide this into 4 parts, kind of thematic groupings, and I want to kind of talk about each of them in turn. And I'm curious about how you landed on these groupings. The first part is the changing West. Then you have forest, wildfire, and water. A third part, wilderness and wildlife. And then the fourth and the longest section, development, sovereignty, and conflict in the West. How did you come to these divisions? Are these something that you started with, or you solicited lots of contributions, then sat with them and moved them around and to see where there was overlap and shared themes? How did this organization come?
Yeah, it was really the latter. We knew what we wanted content-wise in the book, and it wasn't until we sort of started going through the chapters various times that we sort of identified ways that they would sort of hang together or group together well. And then we came up with our different sort of subsections within the book that kind of stuck a little thematically, where you could see the connectivity between the different chapter issues.
And many of these you could move to other sections and they would fit equally
Yes.
as well, right? There's so much overlap.
Yes.
Yeah.
It seems more manageable to break it up into 4 sections versus here's a huge list of chapters to read. And it sort of identifies, like, again, issues that do kind of naturally hang closer together. But as you said, any of these chapters could go in any part of the book and they would fit.
Let's talk about the first section here, the Changing West. And this opens with some discussions of Old West and New West and what it is that's been changing. And actually, we'll get to your conclusion because you guys in the chat and the conclusion that you co-wrote, you kind of returned to this. And Mark Brunson, who you already mentioned, is in this section. He is on. I brought him onto the advisory board of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, and he was the one who tipped me off to your book. And I love Mark. What are some of the big things that are changing so rapidly in the West that political scientists and public policy people need to be thinking about in terms of public lands?
Increasing urbanization, people moving, cities growing larger, bringing in people with different kinds of value systems that are more amenable to maybe environmental concerns. There's also been, economic change in the West as the economies have moved away from natural resource extraction to more service sector employment, which once again attracts a different kind of person with a different kind of value system. And then in a lot of the West, there's been a decline, and there's some areas where rural areas are growing, but primarily a lot of rural areas are declining. Young people are moving out, and that's changing political dynamics in the states. Also, to keep coming back, I think the climate change is changing how we're thinking about things with, seeing Lake Mead started going to historic lows. I drove, Erika did too. I'd be interested to hear what she said, but I drove down to pick up my son in last November and I haven't been over Lake Shasta in a long time, but I saw you drive over several arms. I didn't even see the lake. It was so low. So we got some lot of environmental change going on and demographic and political change. Erika?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that just to even touch on this, just visually, I think people are very aware of sort of seeing things that are significantly different from 5, 10, 15 years ago. Yeah, I also just did the I-5 drive, and on that drive back, there was virtually no snow on Mount Shasta, which is unusual for this time of year. There was a wildfire right outside that area. So we sort of hit all these things. And as we continued north, there was mass power outages from the excessive heat. So, things are sort of happening, and I feel like they're, this is happening more frequently that it's hard to sort of avoid discussions around what's going on and how we're going to accommodate or mitigate or adapt to these changes. But as Brent said as well, I mean, I think climate change is really the big one, in layered with, the political issues that continue around challenges to public lands and these things, like as at a time where we're trying to protect more public lands for a multitude of reasons, for better water quality and to protect water resources or to protect forested areas or endangered species, there's more challenges to these areas as well. So we're there's these multiple things that are kind of creating more conflict. And there's always been conflict, but I think it's more pronounced now that we have this additional layer of climate change changing the scope in which we're, of what we're talking about essentially.
It's part of the tension also, and everything is changing so rapidly, but there are certain segments of the population, certain public lands users who don't want to change as well. They have livelihoods in ways they've been using public lands for years, and they want to continue doing it as such. Isn't this kind of part of I relate the foundation of this tension between the new, rapidly changing West and then perhaps some old West peoples and communities that are still around, right?
Yes. Yeah, we find that, give you an example of that. We had a project, previous NSF project in Central Oregon, and we focused on Deschutes County, which is Bend, which is growing like crazy, and we have a amenity industry growing, lots of young people moving in, changing rapidly, and then we had the Klamath Basin in the study too, and that Klamath Basin is kind of a little bit stagnant economically, and we have a lot of people that still want traditional uses, and we tried to do future scenario building with key stakeholders. And then Ben, we got some agreement on what, there's disagreement how to get there, but what they wanted to see at the end. I mean, what they want public lands to look like. Whereas in the Klamath, a lot of the people were talking about 20 years ago, and it was timber harvests were high, and the economy was different. So yeah, there's very much so that's leading to the conflict.
And perhaps this is where the work that you're doing will help bring people together, like you were saying, getting stakeholders in the room together to talk. One of our law professors here took part in a as a political scientist, and maybe one of our law professors, maybe they're both there, but they took part in a group that went down to Bears Ears. This was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but I don't remember who it was that organized it, but they had gotten people from all sides of that debate and took them all out camping together and literally sat around the campfire and talked about Bears Ears and the protection of cultural resources and accessibility to natural resource extraction, all kinds of things. And they said it was profound that just getting people together to talk was seemed to break down a lot of barriers. People who have just been yelling past each other, online or in public forums or in politics, when they actually talk, they actually do have something to talk about. And it turns out they actually haven't been talking to each other. They've just been talking past each other.
I think that happens a lot. I think that we talk at one another and we don't listen. And I think that that's a big issue. And that's why I think, Brent and I talk about this when we talk about this notion about changing a narrative, about having a discussion and being able to identify commonalities. I mean, it's fine. We're in a country where we can agree to disagree, and that should happen, and it does happen. But there should also be an opportunity to come together and say we, identify the things that we recognize as being important to maybe all of us or to most of us, that we want to work toward those goals. Maybe the ways of getting there are different, but the idea is the same.
At the end of the day, though, there are some things that simply can't really be compromised on, right? And in the second section of the book, you have some chapters on wildfire, which kind of impact everyone. At least they didn't used to impact Corvallis, but they do now, right? And the Willamette Valley. But there's a chapter in there about water, about the Colorado River, right? And conflict in the West often comes down in the end to water. And at the end of the day, there isn't really room for compromise, it seems, when is water going to be used for a kind of residential consumer use or for industrial or agricultural use, which is a bigger a lot of people think, oh, I need to turn the water off when I'm brushing my teeth, which is great. But when you look at the graphs of who's using most of the water, agriculture is actually often bigger than people realize, and industry. And in the end, especially with declining water resources, right? We've seen Lake Mead and Lake Powell. It is a finite resource. It is a zero-sum game. There's only so many pieces of the pie to divvy up. I don't know what the answer to that is, but resources are finite, and the disagreements on how to use them, I don't know how some of those go away. That's not really a question. It's more of a comment than a question.
Brent and I just, we did a large survey project a couple of years back, and we just wrote a paper on water policy, and the rest is just an example. And, what we found, going through various water policy options, people had to, sort of state their level of agreement with. We found across the 4 states that we surveyed that there was pretty strong levels of agreement with all of the water policy support for all of it. So I think that there is, people are aware, at least when we think about water. I think that there's a growing awareness that, we know when we don't have water, we can see it. We know when there's water quality that's affected because of water scarcity or times of drought. And so sort of a sense of like something needs to be done to manage our water resources, to protect either endangered species, to protect drinking water, to protect industry's use, whatever that might be. There seems to be pretty broad-based support for that.
I noticed too, you just saw this in California with agriculture, that they have, grow a lot of rice, which is heavily water dependent. And in the survey that we did, we asked a series of trade-off questions between food, water, and energy. And there's a lot of support for moving to more drought-tolerant agriculture and among all 4 states. And it's California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, versus using water-intensive plants like rice. So there was quite a bit of agreement. There's a little difference between the states too. California has been subject to drought a lot longer than the other states, and so there's a little bit more support for dam building and such and pipelines there than the other 3 states, because the other 3 states often think they might be the target of California's pipeline. So because that plays into our politics too. But there was a lot of consensus among publics in all 4 states.
I mean, I've also read that almonds take a tremendous amount of water to grow almonds, but are people going to stop drinking almond milk, or?
Yeah. Didn't ask
that. Consumers consumers can speak with what they buy and don't buy, right? And right. This often also impacts populations so unevenly. Those that are wealthy, if the price of almond milk goes up, if the price of water goes up, they can afford it. They're fine. It's lower socioeconomic segments of society that bear the brunt. If energy costs go up and they can't afford AC anymore, there are certain populations that suffer unevenly than others, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. But I also think when you just to stick on the example of almonds, I don't think that most people are terribly aware of how much water or how much energy or how much whatever goes into the products that they're buying. If you talk, if you're sort of speaking specifically, like, would you stop watering your lawn to conserve water? People, oh yeah, that's a very tangible, a very notable thing. But thinking about even the things that we purchase, our clothing, our food, whatever that requires an excessive amount of water and energy, it's not generally, I would guess it's not generally on sort of most people's minds. But unless you connect it to something, as you're saying as well, like, yes, if the price goes up on something, you're going to become very aware that, oh, this is because we're using a scarce resource and it's much harder to produce and to have availability for.
I think that's probably the key moment in which people do become aware. It's when it hits their pocketbook, right? We don't know where our food and clothing comes from, generally speaking. I have a kind of a future book project idea to do some local water history here along the Wasatch Front, because I was thinking about locally there's canals and reservoirs and stuff, but some of the canals have been buried. And there's this one paved trail by my house called the Murdoch Canal Trail. And it's this really great long paved trail that kind of goes behind these neighborhoods. And it used to be an open canal. It used to be visually, people saw, oh, here's my water. And now it's buried. Or the aqueducts and pipelines coming down from the canyons and from the reservoirs are buried. And people visually don't see it and don't think about their water in ways that they used to. And you go look through old records from the late 19th century, that's all they're talking about is water, right? And, doing repairs on the pipeline, and it's in the papers and it's in public discourse because they were just much more aware of its scarcity. And now we just turn on the tap and it's there. Right?
Yeah.
So I think, raising public awareness of these issues is key.
I mean, I think it's really interesting because we have the canary in the coal mine, right? We have parts of Central Valley, California that is essentially, starting to descend each year because they're drawing so much groundwater out. There's these things that are happening, but sort of just not, maybe in part because there's so many environmental issues that maybe it sort of becomes very much like, what do you grab onto to think about and to try to to maybe try to invest in a way in improving that situation. But yeah, I think the fact that we are, that these really significant events are occurring, but we're not sort of seeing, strong policies to sort of address that, that's sort of representing a disconnect about what's going on.
That is a problem that when I lived in Nebraska, we were talking about the Oglala Aquifer a lot, and how on the southern plains, the water tables dropped hundreds of feet, and there's wells that simply don't, and there's counties that have said like zero withdrawals from the aquifer. We're just not going to pull anymore because it's not there. And now that I live here in Utah, it's a whole different set of environmental crises that I'm thinking about. And it's interesting that, your point, Erika, there's just so many crises, and it's hard to think about just one or to pin it down. And I wonder if the public sometimes tunes out because, like, well, what can I do? There's just so much. But one interesting thing that a lot of your chapters do internally within the chapters, but then when you read them together, is how interrelated so many of these things are. So you can't think about water resources without thinking about agriculture, without thinking about wildfires, without thinking about the wildland urban interface and growing demographics. Like, it's all interconnected, which it's a little overwhelming to try to take it all on, especially for the general public or for policymakers who want to make a discrete, carefully defined policy that, that they can get voters to approve or to to reelect them because they put forth this one policy. They want a nice little package, and that just doesn't exist.
Right. And I think that when it is happening, then you have policy that exists in a silo and doesn't necessarily consider the other things that you just mentioned. So you can develop maybe some great policy that's going to address a particular issue, but then has negative consequences for another issue. And then so without sort of that both interdisciplinary and sort of ways of thinking and also ways of integrating policy together, it's going to be really challenging to address these and overwhelming. And I think Brent and I are incredibly cognizant of the fact that the field in which we work is not in one, excuse me, where, people are gleefully picking up the book and reading through it and thinking, great, I have a solution. I know what to do. It's really more to continue the conversation and how do we start thinking about at least getting to a place where we can start talking more comprehensively about policies in the West.
Yeah, we have to start these conversations and get everything on the table so we can even think about it.
Yeah, there are some interesting positive things going on too. So for example, in Oregon here, a lot of and we have a colleague in Erika who's been involved in this, and we had a PhD student doing research on this. A lot of irrigators now we had open canals which get evaporation and such, and so they're starting to bury their canals or the ditches now, and then they're putting in low head hydro so that they're not only using the water to grow food, but also producing their own energy. And then they're taking the residues like the stalks and stuff that are left over after food production and changing it into biofuels. And so they're closing the gap there between water and energy. But they're doing it because it's, it has really good environmental outcomes, but it's saving them a lot of money. And so it's kind of a win-win-win. And as more and more irrigators are adopting this, we see other irrigation districts coming in and looking at the progress being made. And so there's a lot of positive things going on too. And then renewable energy is another chapter that we have in the book. So there's a lot more renewables going in, wind. Interestingly, here's another one of these conflicts. So the state, so Oregon, Washington, California have been very aggressive in pursuing our portfolios for greenhouse gas reductions. And so there's been encouragement of adopting renewable energy. So some farmers in the Willamette Valley here, which is, Oregon has really stringent rules on land use for forests and for agriculture, but some farmers started putting solar on their lands, and which then takes some of the land out of production. And so it was kind of people didn't think about, once again, getting back to the complexity of these issues. And so a couple counties have used Oregon's land use laws to prohibit further solar to keep the land into ag production. And so so you start looking at these things. We have, we talk about cascading events when it comes to management of public lands and stuff. And that's just that's not public land, but that's just an example of you're pursuing one policy objective and it ends up impacting another policy objective.
But we'd be naive to think that it'd be anything other than that. There's always going to be unintended consequences.
Yeah.
But I think, especially in the realm of politics, those complexities, cascading events, the nuance of all this, that's not convenient. And politicians rarely like to acknowledge that because the public has a hard time, grappling with that, which again underscores the importance and the value of getting this on the table so people can think about it critically and it can have more comprehensive ways.
Yeah. So another thing too, that this last summer we're doing research, and Erika and I are doing a project on this right now too, in wildfire. A lot of urban folks in the West were concerned about wildfire. They hear about wildfire, but it doesn't really affect them. Well, last summer, we focused on wildfire, but we never focused on smoke. And all of a sudden, the smoke came in, and you're stuck in your house for a week plus, and you can't go outside. Wildfire became very real for you. So the wildfires were horrible, destroyed a lot of land, destroyed cities. At the same time, the smoke, I think, impacted our legislature. Actually took a lot of action on wildfire, which they normally wouldn't have, because the Portland and Eugene and Salem, the capital, were inundated with smoke for a week. And I know the same thing happened in Seattle. So
yeah, we were all breathing California forests and British Columbia forests. The smoke was, you can look at those moving satellite images, and it was astounding how thick and how far the smoke spread across the West not just last summer, but every summer.
Yeah, increasingly.
It hurts me to skip over this third section on wilderness and wildlife because it's the one I've been thinking about the most for my own work. But because we are running out of time, I did want to push kind of towards you guys' conclusion. And because this is also one of the pieces that you guys wrote, you talk in this conclusion, which you entitled "The Old West, the New West, the Next West," which I like that. I've used Old West, New West a lot. But I've never talked about the Next West. But you talk about the disconnect between rural communities and policymakers, and how rural communities, who are often the public land users, feel threatened sometimes by those making policy. You have a little table where you talk about two conflicting natural resource management paradigms that you see through all of the chapters in this book, of a lot of things coming down to these set of conflicting points. One resource management paradigm being biocentric, as you put it, and environment, wildlife, ecosystems, and the other being anthropocentric, thinking about people. Maybe we can close out with a discussion about this. Talk to us a little bit about these two paradigms and the conflicts they create, and then maybe where the solutions are to try to find compromise and consensus between them.
Well, I can start out with an example from my childhood. So my grandparents pretty much raised myself and my two sisters, and they would take us out. We went hunting and fishing. We were always going outdoors, camping all the time. This is in Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho. And they would tell me, so they're of a different generation, the greatest generation, people call it through World War II. And they would always tell me that all these lands were put here specifically for humans, and they were very religious. So God gave us right to manage these lands, and they're here for humans. So very, very anthropocentric. At the same time, they wanted clean water to go fishing in. They wanted a place where they can go hunting, and they weren't rich, so it was often on public lands, Forest Service lands, or BLM lands. And so and then I'm coming from a different generation with different experiences, and so I was kind of developed, like most young people at the time, kind of a more which you see in our laws, EPA and stuff like that, more of a biocentric perspective, that we're all here, and that animals have a right to exist whether humans use them or not. And so we used to have, when I was in college, the dinner table fights. I'd go visit my grandparents, I absolutely adore and love, but we would agree on the ends, but not, the purpose or the means. And so I think that's kind of an example of that. If I could go, Eric, and give an example where you can rectify these. So during the occupation of Malheur Wildlife Refuge, which I like to point out, the people that came and occupied were from outside Oregon. They were not Oregonians, okay? And so when they came and occupied at that time, we had master's and PhD students doing research on renewable energy, water, and endangered species in that area. And they were doing research before the occupation, during the occupation, and after the occupation. And one of the students was studying, there's a proposed wind farm that they were studying. There was some community opposition to it. Another one was just looking at water and climate change. The third student was looking at sage grouse, which is in that particular area. And so what had been happening in that Malheur area is that they have a collaborative in place. And the collaborative has all the local ranchers on it. It's got the Paiute tribe, Native American tribe involved in it. It has Forest Service, BLM involved in it. It has county officials involved in it, city officials, has the state agencies, and then environmental groups from Portland involved in it. And during the occupation, the Bundys cut. They're part of it's to manage the water resources, the watershed, and the habitat for the sage grouse. And so, what they have done is the ranchers had fenced off critical areas of habitat for fish and for waterfowl, because it's on the flyway. And so the Bundys came in and cut the wires to let the cattle into the public lands there. And the ranchers, who are members of this collaborative, even though they may have agreed with many of the things that the occupiers were saying and their policy preferences, they went right out there right away, got the cattle back onto their land, and put the fence back up. And so it's just an example. And there's also another connection. One of the ranchers there, who was the president of the Oregon Cattlemen's Association, he grows free-range beef without antibiotics, and then he sells it to the Portland restaurants, because people in Portland went for free-range antibiotic. And so there's an economic connection has been made. But and they get together, they have meetings, they don't have agreement on everything all the time, but they all in the end want the same thing. And so, and you've got the anthropocentric and the biocentric perspectives that actually want the same management at the end. They don't agree necessarily in technique and stuff, but that's just an example that we talk about.
Erika, do you have any other examples of these tensions between these two kind of management systems, or the way in which maybe those tensions could be overcome?
I mean, I think, again, and I think Brent just stated it and we talked about it earlier, like, I think that we have to get to a point where we encourage both dialogue and interaction. And you mentioned it as well with your example about people going down to Bears Ears. Like, I think that it's critical that we actually start talking to each other, because that's where we start to identify our commonalities. That's where we start to, like, when really great policy has been made, it has been made because of bipartisanship, because of people talking, because of things coming together. And we have the ability to do that. We just need to kind of facilitate that again. Like, how do we start having a good conversation? Similar to Brent, in my family, we were outside all of the time. And so I had that very strong sort of ethic and connection to land. But in my in-laws are ones that grew up in a Midwest farm area. And certainly I politically identify differently, but in terms of connection to the land and in terms of conservation of that land that they occupy, that's very important to them. So there is these like themes that just stick through this, and we just need to kind of highlight those. And I think that we spend a great deal of time talking about our differences and exacerbating this notion that we're all so different. We're in these two different camps and we don't have things that come together. But when you look at public opinion surveys, when you talk to people, these things, you do see this common thread that does connect a lot of the West. And I think that that's what we need to start highlighting more, and that's what we need to start bringing together. And I think politicians can do that, to get to your point, is being able to start having greater conversations around the commonalities that we all share.
I love that. Maybe that's like a good optimistic kind of note to wrap things up on. It also makes me think of this new Republican caucus I think it's just in the House that John Curtis was helping head up, of GOP members talking about climate change, right? But it makes me hopeful that at some point, hopefully in the near future, more people will come to the table and say, hey, we actually have a lot that we agree on and that we can work on together, because we all live here on this planet. We all live here in, say, if we're Westerners here in the West, and these public lands are a great resource, and we can probably find lots of things to agree on and how to manage them, use them, protect them, and so forth. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for this great volume. I'm especially excited that it's open source, and I'll point people to it in print and online, so they can sample from it and hopefully use it for my professor friends, use it in their classes, but also the general public. I think we'll find a lot in here that they could benefit from.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, it's been a pleasure. Take care, guys.
You too.
Great.
Well, that's it for this month. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates, leave comments, and communicate with me. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Rudd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream. We have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, fellowships in categories that nearly anyone researching and working on the region, from nearly any disciplinary approach or towards nearly any kind of final product, can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah, Dahl Anderson, that's Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brent Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, just about everything else, so you can direct praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books and other studies on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or just about anything else, head to bwrensink.org. That's BWRENSINK.org. Or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind.